Hey guys, this is Brother Ray Jones with the First Church of God in Princeton, West Virginia. I want to welcome you to our midweek Bible study. Thank you for taking time out of your busy week to be a part of this time of online learning and growing together. I'm thrilled that I get to be a part of your spiritual development, and I'm thankful that you are a part of mine as well. We're going to be looking together tonight in the book of 1 Thessalonians, the second chapter, verses 1 through, second chapter, verses 1 through 12. We're going to continue our study in the life of Paul, and as we're doing that tonight, we're going to take a little different approach. We're going to look at some of the things that Paul had to say as he wrote back to some of the churches that he had established and visited from time to time. So we're going to be focusing in again on 1 Thessalonians, the second chapter, verses 1 through 12. If you want to go ahead and be turning in your Bibles there, you will be ahead of the game here in just a second. We want to encourage you to participate tonight. You feel free to use those emoji buttons. If you're doing this on Facebook, you feel free to comment. You feel free to participate. We love it when you do that. And as always, if this is a blessing to you and you think it would bless others, we would be thrilled if you would share it with them. Thank you so much for that. As we consider some things about Paul's life tonight, let's remember that we've seen Paul through a whole lot of cities that he's traveled through. He's been in Antioch, he's been in Derbe, Iconium, Pisidia, Troas, Philippi, Appolonia, Thessalonica, Berea, and Athens. And along the way, he's seen a lot of positive results. A lot of people have come to know the Lord because Paul ministered the gospel to them. But he's also stood up against some very stiff opposition. And that's just kind of the way it goes, right? Sometimes people are for you and sometimes they're not. And there was some very stiff opposition from time to time that he met up with. Whenever the gospel is preached, sometimes there's a revival that'll break out, and other times it'll cause a riot. But along the way on this journey, Paul takes some time to write back to some of the churches that he had established. One example of this is that while he was in Corinth, he writes what we now know as the book of 1 Thessalonians in our New Testament. Among the many things that we can learn from that book, one is insights into the apostles' leadership ability. So we're going to focus a little bit tonight on how we can learn about how Paul led people based on some things out of 1 Thessalonians chapter 2. Let me go ahead and read the text for us. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain. But even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict. For our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit. But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts. For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak of covetousness, God is our witness. Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. But we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. So, affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. For you remember, brethren, our labor and our toil for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you. We preached to you the gospel of God. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe. As you know, how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you, as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. When it comes to leadership, we know that leadership is essential. It is key. John Maxwell has said, everything rises and falls on leadership. He would contend that as the leader goes, so goes the organization. Winston Churchill understood this. He led Great Britain against German invasion of World War II. And of his many great speeches, one of them includes the following. Now, this is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. Winston Churchill is now looked at through the lens of history as one of the greatest leaders who ever lived. And he earned that title by the way he dealt with the things in leading Britain through World War II. He delivered those famous words that we just read in a 1492 speech at London's Mansion House just after the British routed Rommel's forces at Alamein, driving the German troops out of Egypt. This battle marked a turning point in the war, leading Churchill to write in his memoirs later, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory, but after Alamein, we never had a defeat." Churchill was definitely a great leader, and thank God for how the Lord worked through him in that particular time in history. But we want to look now at how Paul's leadership was used of the Lord and some things that we can learn about how he led people when it comes to what he wrote to the Thessalonians, okay? One thing that we see very quickly is that Paul had a position of leadership. God called him and appointed him to be an apostle. This is what Maxwell would call like the lowest level of leadership. You have a title. You have a position. You've been given maybe a badge, a name tag that has your position on it. You have the job, if you will, or the position of leadership, and that's important, but quite honestly, that is probably like the entry level of where leadership is. Now, I understand you don't get some positions of leadership until you've proven yourself, and that's understandable. But having the title in and of itself is one thing. After you have the title, you also have to have the other characteristics that come with it that really prove you to be the person that the title says you are, okay? Now, when it comes to spiritual leadership, Paul had this position of leadership because God gave it to him. Now, when it comes to spiritual gifting and the appointments of God, whatever God gives you and entrusts to your care, you want to utilize that to the best of your ability. And I don't want to minimize in any way the gifting of God that he may give us and how that may play into leadership. But understand, again, the position of leadership is at one particular level, and Paul had that, and he didn't ask for this. Remember that. Paul became an apostle because the Lord called him to that and gifted him with that, and Paul said yes. So he did have the position of leadership. But Paul led from more than just position. He also led through leadership, or through relationship, rather. I'm sorry. He led through relationship. And the Thessalonians knew Paul. He spent time with them. As we read down through these these 12 verses, just within the first couple of verses, or within those 12 verses, rather, we have Paul bringing back to their remembrance how he had relationship with them. He wasn't writing just from a position of authority, but he had relational authority with them as well. He highlights in the first verse of chapter 2, he says, "You yourselves know." Then he refers to something else in the second verse, and he says, "As you know, we did this." In verse 5, he says again, "As you know, we did these other things." And then in verse 9, he says, "You will recall how we conducted ourselves." And then in verse 10 of chapter 2, he mentions, "You are witnesses." So this was more than just a position that Paul had with the Thessalonians. He also had relationship with them. And by the way, having the position of leadership is important, but once you get the position, you better build relationship as well. And I know sometimes maybe you get a position because of a relationship, but you have to continue to cultivate that relationship in order to lead well. Moms and dads are to lead in the home. They're to lead their children. And that's more than just having the title of mom and dad. They've got to have a relationship with their kids. I remember years ago, some of the studies that Josh McDowell did about parenting. He said rules without relationship equals rebellion. Relationship is key in leadership. Now, another thing we know from about Paul's leadership, having read through these verses, is that Paul was not deceitful. In verse 3, he highlights, "For our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit." Folks, if we're going to lead well in the home, in the community, in the church, or in your business, or anywhere at all, you can't be deceitful. One of the key things to any good relationship is trust. And if you operate out of deceit, you're going to break trust and you're going to erode your leadership ability. Paul, among the many things that Paul did well, is he was not deceitful. He was respected as a leader because he was honest. He was forthright. He did not use deceit. Not only that, we see from reading this that Paul was not a people pleaser. In 1 Thessalonians 2:4, let me read that again. "As we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts." Paul realized early on if he was going to lead well, he was going to, in the church especially, he was going to have to please God instead of people. Now let me tell you, this is a great struggle for a whole lot of us, including me. I kind of like it when people are happy. I'm one of those people that wonder, hey, how come we can't all just get along? And for a large part of my life, I've kind of operated with this undercurrent within me of kind of wanting to make people happy. But little by little, I've kind of learned how to get over that. It's not that I want to make people out and intentionally make people unhappy, but however, I've learned you can't just strive to make people happy. If you spend all of your life trying to please others, you're going to spend all of your life probably being pretty miserable, okay? And quite honestly, particularly when it comes to God's work and ministry, sometimes what you've got to do is not going to make people happy, but it's pleasing to God. And if you trade just making people happy instead of pleasing God and proclaiming the truth or delivering what needs to be delivered, you're going to be in a lot of trouble, okay? Someone has said if you want to make people happy, you need to go sell ice cream. I believe if you really want to make people happy, you probably have to just give it away, okay? I found out you can make a lot of people happy when you give away cookies. And by the way, I enjoy doing that from time to time. But here's the point. You cannot lead well if you continually try to be a people pleaser. And two of the big things that can operate in the leader's life if he or she does not keep that in check is fear and insecurity. If you operate out of fear or insecurity, you're going to gravitate towards pleasing people, even if you're not pleasing God. Well, Paul didn't have that going on within him. He had wrestled through whatever he needed to wrestle through, and he had settled that while he was not going to intentionally try to displease people, he was going to be more intentional about pleasing God, even if it didn't make people happy. He was not a people pleaser. Not only that, he was not a greedy person. Look at verse 5 of 1 Thessalonians 2. It says, "For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak of covetousness. God is witness." Folks, if we're going to lead well, we're going to have to not be greedy. We can't covet what other people have. I heard the story one time of a couple who was celebrating their 40th wedding anniversary on their 60th birthday. They were both in and around the age of 60, celebrating 40 years of marriage. And a genie appeared and offered each of them one wish. Well, the wife was so thrilled that she looked at the genie and said, "Hey, I want a Caribbean cruise for me and my husband. I wish for 2 tickets for that cruise, 10-day cruise in the Caribbean." And the genie granted the wish. Here were the 2 tickets. They could take off real soon and go on the trip. Well, the husband, he asked the genie to step in the other room apart from the wife's hearing. And he looks at the genie and says, "For my wish, I want my wife to be 30 years younger than me." And the genie looks at the husband and grants his wish, waves the wand, and poof, he turns into a 90-year-old man. He got greedy. It's a horrible joke, I get it. But here's the idea. Greed always backfires on us, okay? Paul wasn't greedy. He was not covetous. He didn't covet. He didn't have covetousness in his heart. And if you're going to lead well in your home, in the church, for the Lord, wherever, in the community, in your business, don't get greedy, okay? Paul was not self-serving. In verse 6 of 1 Thessalonians 2, let me read that again for us. Nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. Paul had a very high position of authority. He was one of the apostles. And there were other apostles going around who might have taken more of the perks or the benefits that came with that. Now, let me be clear. The laborer is worthy of his hire. And if you want to bless those in leadership over you, praise God for that. Do great things for them. In ministry, it's okay to be compensated well. It's okay to be taken care of and to have a livable wage and all those kind of things. But sometimes in leadership, we can not only get greedy, but we can become self-serving. And Paul models for us how we don't need to do that. So if you're in leadership, some of the perks from time to time that you may be able to avail yourself of, it might be good to forego those from time to time. I didn't say you got to do it all the time, but sometimes being sacrificial in those areas is part of being a good leader. Okay, Paul was not self-serving. And by the way, that has to do more than just with monetary things. You can't be a good leader and just be watching out for yourself. You have to serve others to be a good, godly leader. Paul was also sensitive to the needs of others. In verse 7, he highlights that we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. When Paul was leading people and helping lead them to Christ, he didn't back down from the truth of the gospel, but he also was compassionate. He was aware of the needs of others. He knew how to nurture people along the way. Now, he knew how to correct people openly and boldly if he needed to, but he also had that softer side, if you will, and he could assess where people were on the journey and kind of help bring them along the way at the level that they were, like a nursing mother carefully takes care of an infant. Now, Paul wasn't afraid to look at those who should not be infants in the faith anymore and compel them to greater things in clear ways. But when he saw someone was new to the faith, he nurtured them along in healthy ways. Paul also had a healthy affection for people. Verse 8, he highlights, so affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. This goes back to that whole thing of Paul leading not only by position, but by relationship. He gave himself over. He opened himself up to the people he was leading. He loved them and they loved him. Oh, my friends, if you're ever going to lead people well in the church world anyway, you're going to have to love them. You're going to have to be for them, and you're going to have to love them well. That goes for the family, of course. It goes for the church. It goes in a whole lot of life. You have to have a healthy affection for people. Paul also was authentic. In verse 9, it says, for you remember, brethren, our labor and toil, for laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, we preached the gospel of God. Paul was authentic to the core. He labored with his hands. He didn't want to be an unnecessary burden to anybody. And he was just real with his people. He was authentic, and they knew him. Now, that is a key point in leadership today. You don't have to tell everybody everything as the leader about you, but you need to be real. You need to be genuine. I've seen people, been acquainted with people who were one way when they were in public view, but they were way different kind of behind the scenes. I never want to be that way, my friends. If I'm not anything else as a leader, I want to be authentic. If you see me at the local store, I hope I don't look too different or act too differently than the guy you hear talking to you now. Authenticity is essential. Paul was not only authentic, but as we read these words, he was enthusiastically affirming. In verses 10 through 12, let me read them again for us. You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe. As you know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own children, that you would walk worthy of God who calls you into his own kingdom and glory. What is Paul saying here? He is highlighting the aspect of his leadership and his character where he was encouraging and enthusiastically affirming of the brethren. Now, he never affirmed them in their sin, but he constantly encouraged them and affirmed them in their faith and in living for the Lord. Hear me clearly. Paul opposed sin. He called out sin, but he affirmed and encouraged those who had believed to turn from sin and to walk and to live in faith. Oh, my friends, we need that in leadership today. We need leaders who will look at their people, see the good that they're doing, not overlooking the bad, speaking into the things that need to be corrected, but then encouraging them and affirming them in the good things that they're doing. A lot of times we think that only or some leaders will think rather that their only job is to call out what somebody's doing wrong. That's not the case, my friend. You want to affirm people for what they're doing right. And that always lays a seedbed for better performance out of those you're leading. And when it comes to leading in the church and helping lead people or help people grow in their faith, you want to see and identify the things they're doing along the way that are good and affirm that and encourage them to continue in that. Paul modeled that for the Thessalonian believers and for us. So these are just several things that we see in Paul's leadership. He had a position of leadership. He had, when he led more than just by a job title. He led through relationship. He wasn't deceitful. He refused to be a people pleaser. He was not greedy. He was not self-serving. He was sensitive to the needs of others. He had a healthy affection for people. He was authentic. And lastly, he was enthusiastically affirming. My friends, if we model these things in our lives, if we develop these things and we enhance these things as we lead others, then we too will see some great results for the kingdom of God. As we close tonight, I want to encourage us all to do great things for Christ. And I hope that our motive would be just that we simply do great things for the glory of God and not great things just for the sake of being known as great ourselves. That would not be a very high goal. It wouldn't be a God-honoring goal either. Thank you for your time tonight. I hope wherever you are in whatever sphere of influence that you have, I hope that you are leading well. And I hope you lead in a way that gives glory and honor and praise to God. I strive to do that. I encourage you to do the same. Thank you for your time. God bless you, and have a great evening.